everyone, welcome to the Dark Sire Creative Nook on YouTube. I am your host, Zack Shiffman. I am here today with best-selling horror author Richard Chizmar. Richard, can I call you Richard?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we jump right into this interview?
Oh man, I'm pretty much a dinosaur. I've been around the genre since I started Cemetery Dance magazine back in 1988. Started publishing books, I believe, in 90 or 91. Was writing the whole time. Once the business got really kicking and moving, I sacrificed a lot of that writing time and became more of just the publisher editor. But once the new century rolled around, I blocked out some time, started writing some movies with a childhood friend of mine, and got back to working on prose fiction and selling a bunch of short stories, and then eventually some novellas, and now back into novel length work.
All right. So you are a published author, as I mentioned. You've written a bunch of books, short stories. Co-written a book with Stephen King as well. But you have a book coming up this month called Chasing the Boogeyman. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Sure. I always knew that I grew up in a town called Edgewood in Maryland, and it's very much a working class town, suburban type place. It's a military town because there's Edgewood Arsenal and Aberdeen Proving Ground. We're kind of surrounded by that. So you have a lot of families moving in and out, as well as, families that are there, permanent residents. But it was kind of a Wonder Years type town, a lot of, sidewalks rolled up around 9 o'clock at night, and the only ones out there were kids running around, playing games and kick the can and all that kind of stuff. So it was a pretty wonderful place to grow up. But it also had its dark side. It had its wrong side of the tracks and all that kind of stuff. And it's just a very typical, suburban neighborhood. And I always knew I wanted to write a book set there. I always thought it would be like a big horror novel, coming of age type thing. But I had the idea for Chasing the Boogeyman, and it kind of stuck with me. So I sat down and put pen to paper. And what the book's about, a short version, is back in the late 1980s, there were a series of break-ins where an unknown, male would slip into houses at night, usually through unlocked doors or windows. He usually wasn't forced to break into locks or, anything like that, which again kind of reinforces the kind of town it was. And what he would do is, and this is creepy as hell, is he would touch sleeping women. He would touch their hair or their leg or their arm, and then when they woke up, he would take off. He wasn't caught. This happened over 24 times, and the local newspaper, started calling him the Phantom Fondler. And it was just a very creepy time. And, with my mind, the way it works, I was always wondering, when is this going to escalate to something more than just touching? When is it going to escalate to, violence or sexual assault, or, well, technically it already was, but, violence or even murder, something like that. So that's what the book's about. In 1988, I was a freshly graduated college student. I moved back home for about 9 months before my wedding. And that's where I was starting Cemetery Dance, and I was writing. So the idea for the book was, what if there was someone in town who was murdering young females, and I became kind of intertwined in the story. And that's where Chasing the Boogeyman came from.
That's very Phantom Fondler.
Phantom Fondler, true story.
Wow. Yeah, that's weird. So if that was the seed for the story, if the seed for the story was going back to your hometown and going off of this very weird incident that happened, how did it evolve from that into the final form of the story? Did it change much?
You know what? When I sat down to write, here's the weird thing: is I end up making myself a central character in the story. I am Richard Chizmar, so I'm writing about myself. I'm doing exactly what I was doing during that time period. I'm working on the first issue of Cemetery Dance magazine. I'm selling my short stories to, smaller magazines and getting rejected by a bunch of them. It was just a really, I knew I wanted to write about that time because it was a really interesting dynamic. I've freshly graduated from college, right there, you know, a young adult, yet because of the timing with my fiance, you know, and us not wanting to get an apartment and pay that money before we got married, I'm moving back home into the house I grew up in, into the bedroom I grew up in. And it was just a very interesting time and kind of a dynamic to be back home with my parents and in my old neighborhood. And some of my friends are still around, some aren't. So when I originally sat down to write it, I was not the main character. I was just writing about it's going to be a first person narrative about this guy who is walking in my footsteps. But it became really apparent really quickly that no matter what I did, this guy was me. So I kind of took that leap and just assumed the role. And it was very strange because I'm a behind the scenes kind of guy. You know, I don't go to a lot of conventions or writers conferences or those type of things. You know, you have to drag me to get me to go to a party. So here I am all of a sudden, you know, making myself the central role in this book. But yeah, once I kind of got over the initial freak out of doing that, it was a quick book to write, and it was a fun book to write. You know, my parents have been gone for over a decade, both of them. But while I was writing this book, they were both, you know, alive and happy, and I was living under the same roof with them. And you know, a lot of my friends were back in town. So it was a neat experience. And I think because of that, it was a very quick book to write.
So what was it like fictionalizing yourself in that sort of way? Even though it wasn't entirely fictionalizing yourself, you still sort of started off fictional. So what was that like?
You know, like I said, once I kind of took that leap of faith, you know, initially there was a lot of thoughts of, which I think most writers do have, of who's going to want to read this, who's going to want to read about this. And you kind of, at some point you get to the point where you're like, you know what, this is a story worth telling, and it'll find an audience if it's supposed to. So you just forge ahead. And it was the same thing with this, but probably amplified because, again, I'm writing about myself. I'm writing about this period of my life. So the thoughts of who the hell is going to be interested in this were certainly, you know, amplified, like I said. But, you know, other than that, you know, like I just referenced, you know, it was almost at times felt self-indulgent because I was writing about my childhood. You know, I write a section in the beginning of the book, which describes the town and kind of sets the table for the story that to come. And, you know, I wrote a long section about growing up there and my friends. So I'm writing about my real friends and real incidents that happened. And that's just a blast. You know, that was, like I said, it came out really quickly and came out very smoothly. So it was a lot of fun. I mean, it once I got over the uncomfortable feeling of you know, writing about me, it was a blast.
So what about the other characters of the book? Are they based on real people, or who's your favorite?
Some of them are. Some of them are based on, you know, I wrote about, you know, my fiance who's now my wife, and she hated every minute of that. She's really a behind the scenes person. So she you know, cringed anytime I told her I'm writing about you today. And she's, you know, read the book obviously. And so she loved all of it except for the parts about her. You know, as far as my friends, you know, 90% of the characters in the book are real. You know, even the fringe characters that are mentioned once or twice, you know, about 90% of them, you know, my friends loved being included in the book. I checked with all of them and said, hey, you mind being part of this story? And they're like, oh my God, you know, make me the hero, make me the villain. So yeah, everybody else was into it. And, you know, there's one main female character who is almost like a composite of several people I know. But she, you know, she's not real. And if you get a chance to read the book, you'll see who I'm talking about. But she should be real. If there's ever a movie version, I think she's a really cool character to cast.
Who would you cast? Like as like a big actress?
I don't know. I mean, you know what? In the book, she kind of describes herself as what does she say? There's a scene where I'm like, what, you didn't have a date for 4th of July night or something like that? And she's like, what does she say? I'm something, I'm a workaholic and I'm 10 pounds overweight. What do you think? Or something like that. And so it's a great role. Somebody could chew that up.
Definitely.
I'm not sure who.
So what are you hoping after finishing the book, readers take away from it?
You know what? Again, it's at some point in my writing career, I stopped trying to reinvent the wheel. And when younger writers ask me for advice, I usually, other than the usual, just, embrace rejection as part of the process, and kind of wear those speed bumps as kind of a badges of honor, because we all go through it. One of the big things, probably the biggest, most important thing I learned was, write about what's important to yourself, whether it's a person, a place, a moment in time. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Once I stopped trying to make every story, so innovative and fresh and brand new, and just wrote about things that were important to me, that's when I began to find my audience. So with Chasing the Boogeyman, yeah, just, a slice of Americana, a time in the past that was a little bit more innocent, and a place that was a little bit more innocent. And then, this darkness was thrown in. And that's kind of the underlying theme of the book is, once your innocence is lost, or a place's innocence is lost, can it ever be regained? But yeah, just, it's kind of a campfire story blown up a little bit. And that's how I've described it. And, to me, if they get 5 or 6 hours of enjoyment, and it makes them remember a simpler time, for me, that's good enough.
That's good. So, you said this book was kind of quick to write. So compared to other books you've written, including Gwendy's Button Box, which you wrote with Stephen King, how did it compare, the actual writing process?
Those were quick. That was a quick book too. I mean, with Gwendy, Steve and I finished it in a month, because we were just, kind of bouncing it back and forth to each other. And plus, it's, technically Gwendy's Button Box is a novella. It's not a full-length novel. The same thing with the sequel that I wrote by myself, Gwendy's Magic Feather. Even though it says novel on the front, I think it comes in at about 50,000 words. So it's either a really short novel, or it's a longer, novella. But yeah, once I'm into a story, and that's why I like to take breaks in between projects, is because once I'm into a story, I've never been able to kind of maintain that, hey, Rich, just sit down and write your 5 pages a day and be done. Or Rich, sit down and write for 3 hours a day and be done. The story tends to kind of consume me, and I'm, writing, I'm like writing while I'm brushing my teeth, or, I'm taking my laptop out to lunch, because if the ideas come, I need to get it down right away. So I tend to, do that first draft pretty quickly. I mean, Chasing the Boogeyman was 2 months and change for a 90,000 word book. And then, of course, there's, future drafts that take longer, but still, it kind of just spewed out of me.
Yeah. So which of your books have been your favorite to write then?
It's hard. It's hard because every time I'm asked that question, over a period of time, it usually changes. It's hard to, on one hand, it's really hard to top Gwendy. And then, Stephen King and I just wrote the 3rd volume together called Gwendy's Final Task. And that'll be out in February in hardcover, and then it'll be out later in the summer in paperback. It's hard to top that. I grew up reading Stephen King. He's certainly my literary hero and literary father in that regard. So yeah, that's more than dream come true stuff. I never dreamt that big that I would ever sit down and write with Steve King. So yeah, that's tough to top. But then I wrote a novella called Widow's Point with my son, Billy. And if anything can top it, it's that, writing with, the young man who grew up reading books on my lap and watching scary movies with me, and both of us being scared to death, cuddling on the sofa under a blanket, that kind of thing. So yeah, those are probably my favorites. But then, again, Chasing the Boogeyman, which I got to go home again. I feel like I got to step into a time machine and go back, 30 years. And that's pretty, unique experience.
So we talked a bit about, or you talked a bit about this when you were talking about the small town and the aspect of innocence to your book. But what do you think is the appeal of using small towns and suburbs and kind of almost sterile or comfy environments like that as settings for a horror book?
I think, I'm not sure exactly. I think to me, it always comes down to the characters. And that's why, I fell in love. People are like, what was it about Stephen King's work that you loved so much? I fell in love with his characters. And a lot of his books were set in small towns where you have, characters kind of living, different lives, but they're all tied into the same place. And everybody kind of knows everyone's business. That's always interesting to me and I talk about that in Chasing the Boogeyman, especially the kids, especially the teenagers and the younger kids. They tend to see and hear more, even though a lot of times they don't fully grasp what it is they're seeing and hearing. They know where the shortcuts are. They kind of know, the secrets. They're the ones who see, usually see which trash cans are full of, liquor bottles and that kind of thing around the neighborhood, or whose kid's parents, whoops them. So, I think that's partly the appeal, is just that it's a perfect host for a large and varied, character list. And I think there's also something to be said for, suburbs are supposed to be a place of safety. I mean, I think when suburbs were first developed, it was to get out of urban areas and to get away from crime and to get away from, street violence and all that stuff. But what we've discovered over the years is that the suburbs, the bad guys and girls, they just wear masks. They look different. They're our neighbors. And I think that has a lot to do with the appeal.
Yeah, I definitely got that vibe when I read your book, The Girl on the Porch.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's like, yeah, and that's always been a huge appeal of my writing, especially in my short fiction. And that is, we you never know what goes on behind closed doors in these houses. And, the idea that these people are wearing masks and they're very hard to detect what's underneath is pretty scary to me.
Yeah, it's kind of an unsettling thing, for sure.
Yeah.
So given that horror is a genre with many conventions to it, you would say, ghost story, haunted house, etc.,
Right.
hero killer, how do you I know you said you're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but how do you try and avoid predictability and stereotypes and such in your plots?
Again, it's something that I think for me, at least, that's something that I kind of tackle in that second and third draft. The most important thing for me is just to get the story down. And again, now I may have gone too far to the other side, and that, for all I know, there's a bunch of critics out there saying, oh, he's not doing anything interesting and new, or whatever. And that's okay. But I just think you're right. Again, it goes back to writing what's important to you. The story that my son and I, the novella that we wrote called Widow's Point, I was invited into an anthology of sea-related, ocean-related horror stories. And I knew everyone was going to do stories set on ships and out on the open sea. And so I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I said, I'm going to do a haunted lighthouse. And very quickly, the idea of asking Billy to join me, because he has a great mind for this kind of thing, entered the picture. So we had a blast doing this thing together. We had a great time. And it wasn't until after the fact that I realized this is the first overtly supernatural piece of fiction I had written in my career. And I knew that I knew that I was focused on psychological horror, that kind of thing, more of the everyday. But it didn't strike me that this was literally the first one. And again, what came out of that is we didn't try to reinvent the wheel. It's a very traditional ghost story, but it ended up that we ended up telling it in a kind of a different format that we didn't put a lot of thought into it. It was just the way the story wanted to be told. And when the book came out, we got a lot of positive reviews that said, this is the first found footage prose I've ever read. And Billy and I kind of looked at each other, and they're like, the writers, this was a brilliant idea of them. And Billy and I kind of looked at each other and we said, we'll just pretend like we meant to do it. But I think, again, if you focus on the story, those kind of happy accidents tend to happen, from time to time. And you do end up finding, the subject matter might not be fresh, but the manner in which you tell the story will be fresh. That's just a small example of that. But yeah, I don't, that's the thing. I'd be no help in a writer's room right now answering that question, because I'm just like, you know what? That goes back to what I said before. If I try too hard, I end up with a story that doesn't feel, authentic and honest. And that's where my strength is coming from right now. It's just writing what's important to me.
So after you wrote the Lighthouse story, which if so, you said that was the first instance of including supernatural elements in your work. After you wrote the Lighthouse story, then did you sort of have a moment of that was including supernatural stuff was kind of fun, I might do that more often? And
Absolutely.
yeah.
It was almost like, because Billy and I had so much fun writing that, and we threw in a lot of very kind of traditional chestnuts of storytelling, whether it was sound, or somebody's hair moving without there being anything there to move it. Just and it kind of felt like at some point, I remember we said this is our everything but the kitchen sink story, because we just threw in tons of fun elements that were not strikingly original, but hopefully the way it was written and the way the story unfolded, it still scared people, and based on reader feedback, it did. But yeah, when we were finished, I was like, Billy, that was so much fun because there weren't so many rules to follow. We really could throw in these things because it's supernatural. You don't have to explain that moment or that moment. It's just kind of understood or accepted if you tell the story well enough. So yeah, it's something I definitely had a blast with. And now somewhere down the line, there's a haunted house, kind of a novel in me that's kind of itching to come out. But before that, Billy and I are going to write the sequel to Widow's Point, and that'll be a lot of fun.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned Cemetery Dance, at which you're a publisher. So how do you now currently balance being a publisher at Cemetery Dance, running Cemetery Dance, and being an author?
Well, my subscribers would say I'm not balancing it, that I need to get the damn last issue out, which I agree with 100%. And that's my fault. But, it's different. In the beginning, Cemetery Dance was just me. Then it was myself and Kara, my fiance / wife. And then, we brought in, eventually, we brought in a person to help, with the business. So it helped some with the magazine, and we brought in freelancers once we could afford, and we grew. But, for the last 15 or 20 years, we have a full-time staff of people who work on the publishing side of things, 2 big warehouses, office space. So it's different. It's a, now it's a real business, and they're right now pretty consumed with the book side of things, trying to catch up from a down year with COVID, and because we kept buying books from authors, but we weren't really able to publish many because so much of the industry, our slipcase manufacturers, our paper suppliers, our printers, most importantly, they were all either shut down or they were working on skeleton crews. So things are well, at least in the past 6 months have been back to normal. So we've been crunching on that, but we do have an issue of the magazine that's at the printer, so it shouldn't be long before it's out. And yeah, I just I'm not as involved in the publishing side as I once was. Before it was every day, whether it was 10, 12, 14 hours a day, however, whatever the situation dictated. And now I stop by the, CD offices a few times a week, and I'm not there long. I kind of work from home. So got a great staff, and they do good work. And it's just, they just need me to get on the ball sometimes.
That's cool that you can kind of take a step back and be more of an overseer.
Yeah. I mean, it's the only way I've been able to get all this writing done. If I didn't have them, and that's what I always make sure I thank them in print for kind of letting me disappear into my cave and do my thing.
Okay. So as a publisher at a press, as an author too, what advice do you have for emerging writers and even people going into the publishing industry?
You know what? Mainly just what I've talked about. As far as writing, is concerned. With writing, it's I always just say, just be prepared to do the work. It's kind of cliche, and people say it for a lot of different industries, and in most cases it's true, but not all. But in the writing industry, it's certainly true. There are no shortcuts. You've just got to do the work. If you come out of the gate and you're immensely talented, you're still going to run into dead ends, and you're going to hit speed bumps and get rejections. So it's I always just say, hey, embrace that, be excited about that, be excited about the fact that you're now kind of part of this process of becoming a writer, a successful writer, and that it's going to take time. And every time you get that rejection back, you're like, hey, right on to the next one. They all went through this. All those guys you see published in the bookstores and all those talented women you see on the bestseller list, they've all been through this. And now it's my turn. So that's always advice. And then the other thing that I talked about already is find out what's important to you in that period of time, whether it's a person, a place, a thing, an emotion, and find a way to weave a story around that, because you kind of have to trust yourself that what you have to say will be important to others. And I think that's a big thing that for beginning writers is to, when I started, I realized when I put together a collection of my earliest stories that a bunch of them were set in urban settings. And I remember thinking, what the hell did you know about cities, Rich? And it's because I was trying to write different things. And that's good. But those stories come across very much, almost like, comic book stories, and not the good kind of comic book stories, but the kind of one note comic book stories. To use that word again, they're not very authentic, and therefore I don't feel like they're very successful. But that's the best advice I can give to writers. Publishers, it's such a different place now than it was when I started. When I started, there was no internet, believe it or not. I mean, everything was done with stamps and envelopes. And, my earliest marketing was all done with stamps and flyers and postcards. And so much of my time was spent, believe it or not, stuffing envelopes, sealing envelopes, putting stamps on them, buying mailing lists, trying to expand our audience. Nowadays, with everything being so much of it being online, it's just a different world. I guess my biggest overall thing would be similar to what I tell the writers: just be ready for a lot of speed bumps and a lot of dead ends, and make sure it's your passion. If you're doing it just to make money, do something else. If you're doing it to get famous or get glory, do something else. But if it's your passion, then you know what, you can do it. It's just going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of mistakes. We've been around for 35 years and we're still making mistakes. So there's no handbook. That's the big thing, is talk to as many people as you can, pick as many brains as you can, get, ask the guys who have been there for a while, ask them as many questions as they'll allow you. That's what I did. People like David Silva from The Horror Show, was a godsend for me. I was constantly asking questions and listening.
So when you're first getting started, and even now, since you said that you're still making mistakes, how do you deal with those roadblocks?
Just, what I always just used to say, accept the fact I'm going to make mistakes. Just try not to make them twice. And in many cases, especially those first 10 years, you're going to make them 2, 3, 4 times. It's just inevitable, but you just push forward and you learn from them. And again, for me, when I look back, it's interesting because there was Cemetery Dance was going to succeed one way or another. Whether it was, I had to go out and get a full-time job in order to, fund it or whatever. There was never a backup plan for me. And I know that's not, it was perfect for me because I was young, just like I talk about in Chasing the Boogeyman. I was 22 years old, engaged and then freshly married, no children, no mortgage to pay. We were paying for a little crappy apartment, and Kara, my wife, was going to physical therapy school, graduate school. So, I always tell the story. We used one of her student loans to buy our first big ad in Twilight Zone magazine for the magazine. It's like $500 is a lot of money. So yeah, it's just, for me, it was just never, this is what I love to do. And I was working my ass off on it. And I knew I wasn't going to work nearly as hard on anything else. So it was a matter of when it would work, not how or if. And it took a while, it took a while to become, anything even resembling, steady or secure. But I couldn't have done anything else.
All right. Well, we've more or less reached the end of the interview, but I have one more thing. So you mentioned that Wendy's Final Task is coming out in February. Your book, Chasing the Boogeyman, coming out this month, August. So are there any other projects that you want to talk about, and or anything else you want to tell?
No, you're not really. I mean, I've got a couple, movie projects, one with my son and a director named Mark Pavia, who directed The Night Flyer by Stephen King. Really good guy, really talented guy. That hopefully will happen. Hopefully a Gwendy movie will happen. That's in the process, but no, finite details there. And just getting to work on what's next. I still have a couple short stories I need to finish in an introduction, and then I'll get to work on the next book, which may or may not be a sequel to Chasing the Boogeyman.
Awesome. Well, if that's all, then all right, that concludes this interview then. To the viewers, thank you for viewing. And if you like this interview, be sure to like, comment, and share so we can get more eyes on this awesome author's work. Be sure to check out Chasing the Boogeyman once it comes out. Richard, thank you so much for coming in and for all that you have done and are doing for the Dark Sire.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for asking me.
Of course. Thank you so much for coming in. And if that's everything, then take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.